All right, let's dig in. Think about leaving a sealed plastic container of food in the very back of your refrigerator for a year. When you finally pop the lid open, the smell hits you like a physical punch, and the biological fuzz inside isn't just visually disgusting, it is genuinely hazardous to breathe. Now, take that simple everyday concept and multiply it by 1,000. Imagine taking a massive, sealed stone room deep underground. You pack it with organic matter, human remains, botanical offerings, and heavy chemical preservatives. Then, you lock the heavy stone door, not for a single year, but for 3,000 years. What happens to the physics, the chemistry, and the biology inside that enclosed, pressurized space? Mainstream history often refers to these ancient anomalies as curses. Pop culture likes to blame vengeful mummies, angry spirits, or supernatural retribution. But modern science paints a much more terrifying, tangible picture. When archaeologists pry open the forgotten doors of antiquity, they aren't fighting ghosts. They are walking directly into highly concentrated, lethal environments that defy statistical probability. In our last investigation, we looked at the cursed, radioactive, and toxic artifacts that museums refuse to display. But what happens when the curse isn't attached to a single ring or a vase, but an entire ancient complex? Today, we are launching a forensic investigation into 10 ancient ruins, tombs, and locations that modern science and governments outright refuse to open. We are going to look at the terrifying physical, chemical, and biological traps that make these sites completely lethal for human survival. Stick around for number 1 on this list because we are going to look at an untouched underground city surrounded by a literal flowing river of liquid poison that scientists are too terrified to breach. Number 10. The Maya Red Queen's Tomb, Mexico. Deep in the suffocating, humid heat of the Palenque jungle in Mexico, the air is thick with the sounds of wildlife and the overwhelming scent of wet earth. In 1994, a team of archaeologists made a stunning discovery inside Temple 13, a stepped pyramid hidden beneath centuries of thick, aggressive overgrowth. Pushing past heavy limestone blocks, they breached a hidden burial chamber that had not seen the light of day for over 1,000 years. Inside sat a massive monolithic limestone sarcophagus, but the moment they pried the heavy lid open, they didn't find gleaming gold or polished jade. They found a scene out of a nightmare. The entire interior of the sarcophagus, including the skeletal remains of the royal woman inside, was coated in a thick, vibrant, blood-red powder. At first glance, it looked like a profound ceremonial pigment, but the forensic reality was a highly engineered chemical death trap. The red powder was not standard paint, it was pure, highly concentrated cinnabar. In the realm of chemistry, cinnabar is mercury sulfide. It is one of the most toxic, naturally occurring minerals on the planet. When inhaled or absorbed through the skin, the microscopic dust immediately attacks the central nervous system. It causes severe neurological damage, uncontrollable tremors, respiratory failure, and eventually an agonizing death. The archaeologists had to immediately drop their tools, evacuate, and seal the room, returning only weeks later in full hazmat suits and modern industrial respirators. Historians still debate the intentionality of this chemical hazard. Was this simply a sacred color meant to represent the blood of rebirth, or did the ancient Maya deliberately weaponize their chemistry? They possessed advanced, almost unparalleled knowledge of their natural environment. Packing a sealed tomb with a neurotoxic dust ensures that any grave robber who opens the lid will breathe in a lethal dose of heavy metal before they can even reach for the treasure. But this terrifying chemical discovery in the jungle immediately introduces a much larger, more ominous question. If the Maya could accidentally or intentionally use toxic minerals to protect a single tomb, what happens when an entire geological landscape weaponizes an invisible gas? Number 9. The Plutonium at Hierapolis, Turkey. Imagine standing in the center of an ancient sun-baked Roman amphitheater in the ruined city of Hierapolis, located in modern-day Turkey. At the edge of the sprawling ruins sits a dark, unassuming stone archway leading into a small, jagged cave. For centuries, ancient historians like Strabo wrote terrifying accounts of this exact location, calling it the Gate to Hell. According to the ancient texts, any bird that flew too close to the archway would instantly drop dead out of the sky. Any bull led into the cave by the priests of Pluto would collapse and die in seconds without a single drop of blood being spilled. And yet, the priests themselves would walk into the cave, stand over the dead animals, and emerge completely unharmed. It looked like absolute, undeniable, divine magic. For 2,000 years, this was considered a dramatic myth meant to frighten the uneducated masses. That is, until 2018, when Professor Francesco D'Andrea and a team of volcanologists arrived at the ruins with modern atmospheric testing equipment. They discovered that the Romans weren't lying, and it certainly wasn't magic. The ruins of Hierapolis sit directly on top of a massive, highly active seismic fault line. Deep within the Earth's crust, tectonic friction creates massive amounts of volcanic carbon dioxide gas, which vents directly up through the fissured floor of that specific cave. Because carbon dioxide is significantly heavier than oxygen, it doesn't just float away into the sky, it pools at the bottom of the cave like an invisible lake of water, reaching lethal concentrations of up to 91%. The physics of this natural trap are absolutely astounding. Animals that walk on four legs or birds that fly low to the ground instantly breathe the pure, concentrated CO2 and suffocate in moments. But the human priests were tall enough that their heads remained above the invisible gas line, allowing them to breathe the safe, oxygen-rich air floating near the ceiling. It was a perfectly executed, naturally occurring gas chamber. The Romans built an entire religious cult around a geological anomaly. But if geology can create a localized death zone on the surface, what happens when humans accidentally dig into environments that the Earth deliberately sealed away? Number 8. The Paris Catacombs Unmapped Zones, France. 65 feet beneath the romantic, bustling streets and brightly lit cafes of Paris lies an entirely different universe. It is a sprawling, silent labyrinth holding the skeletal remains of over 6 million people. The official, well-lit tourist route covers barely a mile of this underground city of bone. But beyond the locked heavy iron gates and the severe warning signs lies a sprawling 200-mile network of illegal, unmapped tunnels known to urban explorers as the Forbidden Galleries. Every year, amateur thrill seekers bypass the police barricades and vanish into the dark mystery of the deep tunnels. Many never return. But the real danger lurking in the deep catacombs has nothing to do with ghosts, curses, or collapsing stone ceilings. The real documented threat is extreme hypoxia and severe silicosis. As you venture miles away from the ventilation shafts of the surface, the physics of the air itself begins to fundamentally change. Deep sections of the catacombs are entirely cut off from fresh airflow. As ancient organic matter slowly decays in the damp dark, it completely consumes the remaining oxygen, creating terrifying pockets of dead air. An explorer walking into one of these pockets won't smell anything wrong, and their flashlight won't flicker. They will simply start to feel incredibly tired, sit down on a pile of bones to rest, and quietly asphyxiate without ever realizing they are choking to death. Furthermore, the tunnels were originally carved from deep limestone quarries. 2 centuries of stagnant air means the atmosphere in the forbidden zones is saturated with microscopic, invisible silica dust. Breathing it without industrial filtration coats the inside of your lungs with microscopic stone shards, leading to permanent, untreatable respiratory failure. The French police don't lock the gates to protect the bones. They lock them to keep people from walking into a silent, oxygen-deprived void. But while the catacombs of Paris hold accidental atmospheric traps, what happens when an ancient culture intentionally engineers a mechanical vault designed to kill? Number 7. Padmanabhaswamy Temple Vault B, India. In the bustling, vibrant state of Kerala, India, stands the Sri Padmanabhaswamy Temple, an architectural marvel of towering, intricately carved stone that dominates the skyline. In 2011, the Supreme Court of India ordered the secretive, highly guarded ancient underground vaults of the temple to be opened for a public inventory. When officials managed to bypass the heavy iron doors of Vault A, they uncovered a scene straight out of an adventure novel. The room was packed to the ceiling with solid gold thrones, diamond-studded crowns, and sacks of precious gems, holding an estimated modern value of $22 billion. It was the greatest treasure discovery in human history. As they moved deeper into the temple to open Vault B, the ancient structural engineering stopped them dead in their tracks. Unlike the other doors, the entrance to Vault B is a massive solid slab of iron. There are no keyholes, no hinges, and no visible latches. The door is guarded only by the terrifying massive carvings of two giant cobras. According to the ancient religious authorities, the door is sealed by a nagabandham, a highly specific acoustic seal that can only be opened by a specific sonic frequency or chant. Mainstream archaeologists often dismiss acoustic locks as pure Hollywood fantasy, but modern acoustic physicists are not so sure. The science of cymatics proves that sound waves carry massive physical force. We know that certain low-frequency sound waves can shatter glass, vibrate massive sheets of metal, and even levitate small objects. If the ancient temple architects understood the resonant frequency of the massive iron door, it is scientifically plausible that the door is held in place by a series of internal, pressurized, counterweighted locking tumblers. These tumblers wouldn't require a physical key. They would require a specific sustained vocal frequency to vibrate the metal at the exact hertz needed to release the internal pressure. If a modern drill attempts to pierce the iron, the violent, chaotic vibration of the machinery would trigger the failsafe, permanently dropping the internal stone counterweights and sealing the vault forever. Furthermore, researchers suggest that Vault B is mechanically tethered to the Arabian Sea. Attempting to force the door open could trigger a deliberate, catastrophic structural collapse, flooding the entire temple complex with millions of tons of pressurized ocean sand and crushing the excavators instantly. The Supreme Court indefinitely halted the opening of the door, and the mystery remains perfectly sealed. But while the Indian temple hides an engineered mechanical threat, there is a cave in North America where extreme thermal physics acts as an absolute barrier to human life. Number 6. The Cave of Crystals, Nica, Mexico. Imagine stepping into a cavern that looks exactly like Superman's Fortress of Solitude. Massive, gleaming, translucent white crystals, some measuring over 39 feet long and weighing 55 tons, jut out of the floor and ceiling at wild, impossible angles. Discovered 980 feet below the surface in Nica, Chihuahua, Mexico, it is arguably one of the most visually stunning natural locations on planet Earth. But you cannot go inside, and if you tried, you would be dead within less than 15 minutes. The Cave of Crystals is a terrifying masterclass in extreme, lethal thermal physics. The cavern sits directly above an active subterranean magma chamber. This geothermal furnace heats the air inside the closed cave system to a blistering 136 degrees Fahrenheit or 58 degrees Celsius. But heat alone isn't what kills you. The cave has a relative humidity of up to 99%. Here is exactly why that specific combination is an absolute death sentence. The human body survives extreme heat by sweating. As the sweat evaporates off your skin, it cools your blood. But in an environment with 99% humidity, the air is already completely molecularly saturated with water. Evaporation is physically impossible. When scientists and explorers briefly entered the cave, they had to wear massive custom-built refrigeration suits packed with solid ice. Without the suit, the searing, humid air actually begins to condense inside your lungs. You essentially drown in your own body fluids while simultaneously burning alive from the inside out. The cave is a breathtaking, beautiful, perfect geological weapon. But if nature can weaponize an environment with heat and water, what happens when human warfare permanently poisons the very dirt we walk on? Number 5. The Somme Zone Rouge, France. Stepping slightly out of ancient history and into the early 20th century, we find a landscape that bridges the gap between archaeology and a modern apocalypse. In northern France, there are massive tracts of serene, quiet, towering pine forests. But if you walk to the edge of the trees, you will find miles of heavy fencing covered in signs displaying a skull and crossbones, reading Zone Rouge. the Red Zone. These massive forbidden forests marked the exact locations of the Battle of the Somme and Verdun during World War I. During these brutal conflicts, an estimated 1 billion artillery shells were fired into the mud. When the war ended, the French government realized a terrifying truth about the physics of modern warfare. The destruction wasn't just on the surface. The fundamental chemistry of the earth had been irreversibly altered. Millions of chemical weapons, including mustard gas, phosgene, and arsenic shells, failed to detonate and sank deep into the mud. Over the last century, those iron casings have rusted away, leaking highly concentrated, lethal toxins directly into the water table and the soil. Environmental scientists testing the ground in the Zone Rouge found that the soil in some areas is comprised of up to 3% pure toxic lead. The arsenic levels are tens of thousands of times higher than what is considered safe for human contact. The ground is a massive toxic sponge. Nothing can grow there. The water ground is completely poisoned. The French government didn't just fence it off. They legally decreed that humans are banned from building, farming, or living on this land for the next 700 years. It is a sobering reminder of the permanence of chemical destruction. But you don't need a billion artillery shells to create a dead zone. Sometimes all it takes is a microscopic biological spore locked in the dark for 5 centuries. Number 4. Tomb of Casimir IV, Jagiellon, Poland. In 1973, a team of eager archaeologists stood inside the cold, damp stone walls of the Movile Cathedral in Krakow, Poland. They had just received unprecedented permission to open the 500-year-old tomb of King Casimir IV Jagiellon. As they pried the heavy, rotting wooden lid off the king's coffin, a rush of incredibly stale, dead air hit their faces. They brushed it off, documented the royal remains, and celebrated the massive historical discovery. Within a few days, the celebration turned into a forensic nightmare. 10 of the 12 scientists who were in the room when the coffin was opened suddenly developed severe, unexplainable illnesses. Within weeks, they began dropping dead from massive strokes, heart failures, and aggressive respiratory collapse. The European media immediately panicked, running terrifying headlines about the curse of the Polish king and comparing it to the legendary murderous wrath of the pharaohs. But modern microbiologists weren't looking for magic, they were looking for pathogens. When they swabbed the inside of the dark, sealed wooden coffin, they found the real killer, Aspergillus flavus. This is a highly resilient, naturally occurring fungus, but when it was sealed inside the pitch-black, slightly damp tomb with the organic remains of the king, the fungus didn't simply die off, it thrived. It fed on the decaying biomatter, mutating and producing highly toxic aflatoxins over the course of 500 uninterrupted years. When the archaeologists opened a lid, they inhaled a massive concentrated cloud of prehistoric fungal spores directly into their lungs, instantly overwhelming their modern immune systems. The tragedy fundamentally changed the way museums and archaeologists approach sealed environments. But while this was an accidental, localized incubation, what happens when an entire island is deliberately used to incubate the deadliest plague in human history? Number 3. Poveglia Island, Italy. Floating in the beautiful, shimmering blue waters of the Venetian lagoon in Italy sits a small, overgrown piece of land known as Poveglia. From a distance, it looks like a picturesque Mediterranean getaway. But if you try to hire a boat to take you there, the local captains will outright refuse. The Italian government has strictly, legally banned anyone from stepping foot on the island. Poveglia is not hiding a cursed artifact. The island itself is the biohazard. Beginning in the 1300s, when the bubonic plague ravaged Europe, Venice needed a place to send the infected to keep the floating city from entirely collapsing. Poveglia became a massive open-air quarantine zone. Hundreds of thousands of infected, dying souls were shipped to the island. When the daily death toll outpaced the gravediggers, the bodies were simply stacked in massive piles and burned in open-air pits. Centuries of this dark, apocalyptic process completely altered the physical geology of the island. Modern core samples and historical estimates suggest a terrifying statistic. Up to 50% of the actual topsoil on Poveglia Island is composed of human ash and the decayed biomatter of plague victims. It is an island built on the molecular remains of a pandemic. The ruins of the old hospitals and bell towers are slowly being swallowed by the aggressive, overgrown vegetation. It is not an issue of ghosts or hauntings. It is the absolute fact that the soil is a deep, dark cocktail of ancient pathogens and human remains that modern health officials simply do not want disturbed by footprints or shovels. And this grim biological reality perfectly explains the mechanics behind the most famous curse in the history of archaeology, one that shocked the world in the scorching sands of Egypt. Number 2. King Tutankhamun's true curse, Egypt. In November of 1922, the blistering sun beat down on the Valley of the Kings. British archaeologist Howard Carter stood before a sealed stone doorway, his hands trembling with anticipation. He chiseled a small hole in the upper corner, inserted a flickering candle, and peered into the darkness. When asked what he saw, he uttered the now famous words, "Wonderful things." He had discovered the completely untouched tomb of the boy pharaoh, King Tutankhamun. But the triumph quickly turned to absolute terror. Just 6 months after the tomb was opened, the expedition's wealthy financier, Lord Carnarvon, developed a severe fever and died in a Cairo hospital. Soon after, several other members of the excavation team suffered bizarre illnesses, sudden strokes, and blood poisoning. The global newspapers coined it the Curse of the Pharaohs, claiming that an ancient magical hex was killing anyone who dared to disturb the resting place of the boy king. But modern epidemiologists and pathologists look at the timeline and see a textbook case of extreme biological exposure. Let's look at the actual physics of an Egyptian tomb. When a pharaoh was buried, the massive stone sarcophagus and the heavy tomb doors were sealed with wet plaster and thick resin. Inside the room, priests left massive amounts of organic offerings, raw meats, fresh fruits, vegetables, and vats of wine to sustain the king in the afterlife. This created a perfect hermetically sealed biome. Over 3,000 years, the oxygen inside was completely depleted. The organic food rotted, releasing heavy concentrations of ammonia gas and formaldehyde into the trapped air. More terrifyingly, bacteria present on the mummy and the offerings, specifically ancient strains of Staphylococcus and Pseudomonas, continued to aggressively evolve in the dark. When Carter and Carnarvon smashed a hole in the door, they didn't unleash a magical ghost. They broke a 3,000-year-old pressurized seal, inhaling a massive, highly concentrated cloud of ancient ammonia gas and mutated respiratory bacteria. Lord Carnarvon, whose immune system was already severely compromised by a previous severe car accident, never stood a chance. The curse was nothing more than prehistoric biology acting exactly as science dictates. But as terrifying as a lungful of ancient tomb bacteria might be, what happens when biology is locked away for millions of years instead of thousands? Before we look at the apocalyptic chemistry of China's first emperor, we have to look at a subterranean location that proves how terrifying biology can become when it is completely locked away from the sun. In 1986, Romanian workers were testing the ground for a new power plant near the coast of the Black Sea. When they drilled a test shaft 65 feet into the earth, they accidentally broke into a sealed limestone cavern known today as Movile Cave. But this wasn't a normal cave. It was an alien world. Geological testing proved that the entrance to this cave had been perfectly, hermetically sealed by an earthquake over 5.5 million years ago. For 5.5 million years, not a single drop of water or ray of sunlight had entered the chamber. When scientists descended the shaft in full breathing gear, they discovered that the atmosphere inside was lethal. The oxygen levels were half of what humans need to survive, and the air was thick with highly toxic hydrogen sulfide and carbon dioxide. Breathing the air would cause a human to lose consciousness in minutes. But the terrifying part wasn't the gas, it was what was living in it. Despite the absolute darkness and toxic air, the cave was crawling with life. Scientists discovered 48 completely unique species of bizarre, mutated insects, massive leeches, and water scorpions that exist nowhere else on the planet. Because there's no sunlight, these creatures don't survive on photosynthesis. They survive on chemosynthesis.
They literally feed off the toxic sulfur and methane gas leaking from the cave walls. They have no eyes, their bodies are completely translucent, and they evolved in a completely closed-loop toxic ecosystem. Movile Cave is a terrifying reminder of how utterly resilient biology truly is. It proves that if you seal an environment for long enough, the chemistry of the air will change, and the biology will aggressively mutate to survive the new toxic reality. And it is this exact terrifying scientific principle that leads to the ultimate forbidden underground trap. Number 1. Qin Shi Huang's Mausoleum, China. In 1974, a group of local farmers were digging a water well in the dry red dirt of Shanxi province in central China. Deep in the earth, their shovels hit something hard. They brushed away the dirt and found a life-sized face made of fired clay staring back at them. They had accidentally stumbled upon the legendary terracotta army, over 8,000 highly detailed, unique clay soldiers, chariots, and horses buried in the earth. It is one of the greatest archaeological wonders of the modern world. But here is the massive, lingering mystery that most people don't know. The terracotta army is just the perimeter guard. The actual tomb of the man they're protecting, Qin Shi Huang, the terrifying first emperor of China, sits a mile away beneath a massive 250-foot-tall pyramid of earth. And to this day, the Chinese government and the world's leading archaeologists outright refuse to open it. The hesitation comes from the writings of the ancient historian Sima Qian, who penned a description of the tomb a century after the emperor's death. He wrote that the emperor demanded his final resting place be an exact working replica of his entire vast empire. The ceiling was embedded with precious stones to map the cosmos, but the floor was the true marvel and the true terror. The historian claimed the underground landscape featured the great rivers of China, the Yangtze and the Yellow River, along with a vast ocean. But the water wasn't water. The rivers and oceans were made entirely of flowing, liquid mercury. For decades, modern historians laughed this off as a dramatic, impossible myth. Then, modern science arrived. Geologists and chemists from the Chinese Academy of Sciences took core soil samples from the massive earthen mound covering the tomb. When they ran the dirt through mass spectrometers, the results sent shockwaves through the scientific community. The ancient historian wasn't lying. The dirt covering the central tomb contains concentrations of mercury that are up to 100 times higher than naturally possible in any geological setting. Furthermore, the highest concentrations of the toxic metal form a distinct map that perfectly mirrors the ancient river systems of the Chinese Empire. To truly understand why modern science is paralyzed by this discovery, we have to look at the terrifying physics and weight of liquid mercury. Mercury is incredibly dense, 13 times heavier than water. To fill a scale model of China's river systems, the ancient engineers didn't just need a few buckets, they would have required hundreds of tons of liquid metal. But mercury doesn't occur naturally in liquid pools. It has to be violently extracted from cinnabar ore by roasting it at over 1100 degrees Fahrenheit. The sheer scale of the industrial furnaces required to produce this much liquid mercury would have poisoned the sky for miles. The laborers who built this underground river would have died agonizing deaths from severe heavy metal toxicity, their nervous systems completely collapsing before the tomb was even finished. Furthermore, the ancient texts state that this mercury wasn't just sitting in a stagnant pool. The emperor's engineers supposedly created complex mechanical water wheels to keep the heavy liquid metal constantly flowing and circulating, simulating the ocean tides. Imagine the mechanical pressure required to push hundreds of tons of liquid silver through stone channels. If archaeologists open those doors, they aren't just facing gas, they might be walking into a room where ancient toxic hydromechanics are still functioning in the dark. The moment fresh oxygen hits that pressurized environment, the chemical oxidation could trigger a massive, rapid expansion of toxic vapor, instantly corroding the modern hazmat suits of the excavators. It is the ultimate, perfect trap. The emperor did not rely on a magical curse or a supernatural warning. He relied on the brutal, unbreakable laws of chemistry.